Hello ladies and gentle ladies, and welcome back to another Minecraft modding tutorial for 1.21 Fabric. And in this tutorial we're going to be adding some flowers. So I know this is a bit random, but flowers are quite complicated. They are not super basic, so I figured we might as well get them over and done with, and then you can move on to the more interesting things, to say the least. So the first thing we're going to want to do, as usual, will be to register the blocks. So we're going to first create the flower, and then we'll have to create a flower block that will correspond with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a public static final, and this will be a flower block, and I'm going to call this example underscore flower, and that'll be equal to register with item, and this will be example underscore flower, and then we're going to want a new flower block. Now inside of here we are first going to, well, we can do two things here. So we can either choose to directly provide a suspicious stew effect, or we can choose to give it a component that will allow us to provide multiple effects. So we're going to go down the second route, but I will show you the first route first. So inside of here what we can do is we can say status effects dot, and we can choose to give it an effect, for example Dolphin's Grace, and then we can give it a time, and I believe this is in seconds, and that is a float. And then we can choose to give it a, well, we can't choose, but we have to give it a setting. So we can do abstract block.settings, which needs to actually be abstract block.settings.create, and then we need to provide some properties on this. So let's just quickly do this first, and then we'll go back to what if we want multiple effects. So the properties that we need to provide this are going to be the map color first of all. So we can say map color, and we can choose to give it a map color that we think would be relevant. I'm just going to choose like a dark red, because that's the color my flower is going to be. Then we're going to need to say that it has no collision. We're also going to need to say that this will break instantly, and we're going to need to provide the sounds. So for the sounds, I'm just going to go with block sounds group dot grass, since I think that's the closest one. That's what the vanilla flowers use. Then we need to say that it has an offset, which will be abstract block dot offset type, and we're going to say that this is offset on the X and Z axis, which basically gives it that randomness when you look at it in the game. So it will have some randomness in terms of the X and Z on that position. And then finally we need to say that the piston behavior for this block will be piston behavior dot destroy. Okay, so that's basically all of the properties that we need. So how can we do this if we want to have multiple effects? Well, we can create a method that will help us with this. So I'm going to come down to the very bottom here, and I'm going to create a new method. So this will be a private static, and this is going to return a suspicious stew effects component. And I'm going to call this create stew effects. And this will pass in a suspicious stew effects component dot stew effect, and this is going to need to be a var arg. So we're going to do dot dot dot, and we're going to call this the effects, like that. And then we are going to return a new suspicious stew effects component, which will take in list dot of, and that will then take in the effects. So then we can go ahead and replace this here with create stew effects. And then we can give it as many different effects as we want. So we can do a new stew effect, and this is going to need to take in your status effect. So we can do status effect, for example, speed, and maybe we want this to be for 400. Now this is in ticks, not seconds, unlike the other one. So 400 ticks there, and then we can choose to do another one. So we can do status effects, for example, dot jump boost maybe, and maybe we also want that for 400 ticks, and you get the point. And then as long as you add a comma, that will be everything we need for that. So that's how you can do that. So you can choose to use either way. If you have multiple effects, then you should do it this way. If you just have the single effects, then just doing it default into the constructor is perfectly fine. Next, let's go ahead and register the flower pot. So we're going to want a public static final. This will just be a block because vanilla is a little bit janky, and you'll see why in a second. And this is going to be an example underscore flower underscore pot, which is going to be equal And this is not going to use our register with item method since we don't want an item registered for our flower pot. So we're just going to use our normal register method, and we're going to call this example flower pot, like that. And then what we're going to pass in for the block here is going to be blocks dot create flower pot block, and that is going to pass in our example flower. Now, if you go into this method here, you will see that this just goes ahead and creates a flower pot block, and it creates the settings for us as well. So that just basically saves us a little bit of time. If you wanted to, of course, you could just do this yourself, and that also means you could have this set as a flower pot block field, but you will notice that this just returns a block instead of the flower pot block, which is a little bit cringe, but it is how it is, so that's what we have to do. Obviously, you could, if you really wanted to, you could cast this to a flower pot block, and that would be a perfectly safe cast to be able to do that. I'm personally not going to worry about doing that. It's not that big of a deal. We're probably not even ever going to reference this outside of this class, so it doesn't really matter. Once we have done that, we are actually going to come into our client source set for the first time. And inside of our client entry point, we are going to register the render layer for this block. And that is because flowers are not obviously, they're not completely opaque. They might have some transparency or some translucency in them. And so we're going to need to set a render layer so that it knows that it's not going to be fully opaque. Otherwise, it'll be just rendered as a black background when it's transparent or translucent. So all we need to do is we need to say block render layer map dot instance, and we're going to say put block, and we're going to say block init dot example flower. And I think we can actually use, if we want, put blocks instead, and then we can say render layer dot get cutout, and then we can provide the blocks that we want to match this. So we can also do block init dot example flower pot, and cutout is the one that we want if there is transparency, but if we have translucency, then we're going to want get translucent instead. So I think there is specific values on what that is. I think if it's below 15%, then you use cutout or something like that. You can just mess around with it, see which one works for your specific use case. But I know that I'm going to want cutout for mine. So we can now close that class, and we can also go ahead and close our block in it since we're not going to need that. And now let's quickly go ahead and do the data gen, just get that over and done with, since this is also going to be a little bit different to normal. So we're going to do the flower first, which will just be a normal add drop. So we'll do block init dot example flower. And then for the flower pot, we're going to use add potted plant drops, which will use our flower pot. So like that. And that's all we need for the loot tables. Then let's go ahead and do block tags. So we are going to want to add our flowers to some tags. We're going to need to use git or create tag builder, and we're going to start with block tags, and mine is just a small flower, so I'm going to use the small flower tag, and then I'm going to add block init dot example flower. Then we're also going to use the flower pot one as well, so we're going to use block tags dot flower pots, and we're going to add block init dot example flower pot, like that. Okay, that is our block tags done. Let's do the lang as well. So we're going to do translation builder dot add block init dot example flower, and I'm just going to call this example flower. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for our flower pot. So we're going to do block init dot example flower pot, and we're going to call that example flower pot. Okay, perfect. Now let's do our models as well. So this is also going to be ever so slightly different than normal. So we're going to need to use block state model generator dot register flower pot plant. This will first take in our flower, so we're going to use example flower. And if we don't want a pot, then we can choose to use null here. But since we have registered a pot for ours, we are going to use block init dot example flower pot. And then finally, we're going to need to say whether or not this is a tinted flower. And if it is, then we'll need to use that specific tint type. We are not going to be using a tinted flower here, so we're going to choose not tinted. However, if yours is tinted, then you just use tint type dot tinted. So we're going to go not tinted. Okay, that is our model provider done. And if you have any necessary recipes, for example, if you want to create a dye for your flower, then you'll need to add your recipe in here. I'm not going to worry about doing that, so I'm just going to leave that out. Okay, now that we have done that, we can go into our configured feature in it, and we can start to get our flower generated in the world. So let's create our key first. So we're going to go with a public static final registry key of type configured feature as normal. This first is going to be our example underscore flower underscore key, which is going to be equal to register key, and I'm just going to call this example underscore flower. Then we're also going to want to register another key, which will be a registry key of type configured feature, and this will be an example underscore flower underscore patch, since we're going to need to register a flower patch as well as the actual flower itself. So we're once again going to do register key example flower patch. Then inside of our bootstrap method at the very bottom, what we can go ahead and do is register our flowers here. So the first thing we are going to want to do is we're going to need a registry entry lookup for the actual placed features this time. So we're going to do a registry entry lookup of type placed feature, and this is just going to be called the registry lookup. I'm not too worried about calling it anything else, and I'm just going to set this to context.getRegistry lookup registry keys dot placed feature. Then what we're going to do is we are going to register our test. Then what we're going to do is we are going to register our example flower key first. So we're going to call register, and that will take in our context. Then it will take in our example flower key. Then this will take in the feature, which is actually going to be feature.simpleBlock. Then we are going to need to provide the config that we're going to use for this feature. Now, the config that we are going to need is a new simple block feature config. And then inside of here, we need a specific provider that will be used for the block state. So you have pretty much two choices that you can use here. The first one is very simple, and so that's the one I'm going to show you first. So that will just be block state provider dot of, and then you can go block init dot example flower. And that works perfectly fine if you just want to register a single flower within this flower patch. However, if you want this to be a flower patch that has multiple different types of flowers, things get a little bit more complicated. So in the case that you have multiple flowers, you're actually going to want to use a new noise block state provider. And inside of here, you first need to provide a seed. And this seed effectively can be whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. This is a long, so you just need to choose a value that you think will be good. As I say, it doesn't really matter. It's just a seed, so it's basically a random number. So we can choose something like 4583, and you could mess around with this if you think a different number works better, and that will be fine. Then we need to provide some noise parameters. So we're going to use a new double purlin noise sampler dot noise parameters. Then we need to provide the first octave, which I'm going to put 0, and then you can provide your amplitude as well, which I'm going to put 1. Basically, that's what vanilla uses, so that's what I'm going to use as well. And you'll see that actually you can also choose to provide the additional amplitudes beyond that as well if you want. I'm just going to keep it like that. That's what vanilla uses, and I'm not going to mess around with that any more than I need to. Then we can also provide the scale that will be used for this noise. Now, I am not an expert in world gen, so I unfortunately cannot tell you what this scale is actually used for, but the number that vanilla uses is this. So you can mess around with this however you want. I'm just going to use what vanilla uses because I know that it works. Then the final parameter that it wants is going to be the list of states that it will choose to use. So we're going to use list.of, and we could just pass in as many different states as we want. So we can do block init dot example flower. And then we're going to need to do .get default state. And then if you had another flower, you could do block init .example underscore flower underscore 2 .get default state, and etc, etc, and you can add as many of these as you want. And then once you're done with that, you can close it off and that will be fine. Now obviously I only have one flower, so I'm not going to do any of that, but you can choose to do that if you wish. The next thing that we need to do is register the flower patch. So what we're going to do is we're going to call register. We're going to pass in our context. We're going to pass in our example flower patch key, and then we're going to pass in feature.flower. Then we're going to need to provide the config, which will be a new random patch feature config. Now this is going to have 3 integers at the very start. So the first one will be the number of tries that it has. I'm just going to put around 64 tries, since I want to be able to find this relatively easily, and you can obviously mess around with these values as much as you want after you've actually tested that they work, of course. So I'm just going to have some reasonably high numbers for these. The second parameter is going to be the XZ spread, so basically how much it will spread on the X and Z axes. I'm just going to put around 6 because I don't want it to spread too much from the position that it chooses. And then I'm going to have a Y spread of 2 because on the vertical axis you don't want it to be spread too much. Actually, we can have it maybe a little bit higher just so we find it easier. So let's actually increase both of those a little bit. There we go. And then the final thing that it's going to need is a reference to our placed feature. So we can use our registry lookup and we can say get or throw, and then we can pass in our placed feature init .example underscore flower underscore key. And we're going to need to create that now. So inside of our placed feature init, we're first going to need to create our keys. So we're going to go with a public static final registry key of placed feature, and this is going to be our example underscore flower underscore key, which will be equal to register key example underscore flower. Then we're going to need to do the flower patch, so we're going to need to do registry key of placed feature, which will be example flower patch underscore key, which will be equal to register key example underscore flower underscore patch. Then at the bottom of our bootstrap method, we're going to call the register method, which is going to pass in our context, and then we're going to pass in our example flower key, and then we are going to need to use the registry lookup to get our configured feature. So we're going to say registry lookup .get or throw, and this will use configured feature init .example flower key. Then we are going to want our list of modifiers. So for this, we're going to use a list.of, and we're going to use block filter placement modifier .of, and all we're going to use is block predicate .is air. So effectively this means that it will look for a place where the block is air. So if you want to allow for more places for this block to spawn other than just air, obviously you can modify this block predicate however you want. So you can use all of, which will allow you to have multiple block predicates, any of, both of, either of, etc, etc. You can check that it just has a sturdy face. You can check the matching blocks that it will have. You can have matching block tags, matching fluids. You can say that it just needs to be replaceable. You can say that it needs to be solid. You can say unobstructed, all these kinds of things. You can have is air or water as well. So if you want it to allow to replace water, which you might have for something like kelp, for example, you might use that. But we're just going to use is air just to keep it nice and simple, and we'll be able to find it much easier than if we go any other route. Then we're going to need to register our flower patch. So we're going to use register context. We're going to pass in our example flower patch key. This is once again going to use our registry lookup to get or throw, and that's going to pass in configured feature init .example flower patch key. And then we're going to need to provide our placement modifiers. So we're going to have a few different modifiers for this one. The first one that we're going to want will be a rarity filter placement modifier .of, And this is the basically rarity, so the chance that this place feature will spawn. So I'm just going to use a chance of about 64 to keep it safe so we can find it nice and easily. Then we're going to want a square placement modifier .of, and I believe what this does is it makes it square on the chunks. I believe that's what that does. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that you do need this because that is what vanilla uses. And then we're going to want placed features .motion blocking height map. And effectively this means that it will use this specific height map to determine whether it can place the feature there or not. And then finally, we're going to want a biome placement modifier as well, which will just check that basically the biome we choose will be the correct biome. Okay, now that we've done that, you see that it has fixed our error inside of our configured feature init, and we can go into our biome modification init. So inside of here, this is going to be very, very simple and very, very similar to our OrGen. So all we're going to do is biome modifications.add feature. We're going to first provide the biome selector, so biome selectors. And just so that I can find this nice and easily for this tutorial, I'm just once again going to use found in overworld, but obviously you might want to choose specific biomes for yours. So for the actual generation step, we're going to want feature.vegetal decoration instead of underground ores. By using this specific generation step, it will generate at a specific time during the world gen, instead of, for example, generating at the wrong time. For example, if we used underground ores, then the surface might not have yet generated correctly. So we just want to use vegetal decoration so that we know it generates with all of the other vegetal decoration features. Then finally, we just need to use our placed feature. So we're going to use placed feature init dot, and we're going to provide with our example flower patch key, because we want the flower patch to generate, not just the flower on its own. After we have done that, that should be absolutely everything. So just make sure you have added your texture, of course, inside of textures block and your example flower. So this is mine. And then we need to run our data gen as normal. So the next thing we need to go ahead and do is add our flower to the flowers item tag. So if you don't have the item tag provider, I did create this in the tools video, so you'll have to go back to that one if you want to know how to create it. If you want to create it in this tutorial though, it is effectively just the exact same as our block tag provider, except basically with items. So it's just a fabric tag provider of type item, compared to this one, which is a block tag provider, and then we just pass in the registry keys.item into the super there. So it's relatively simple, it's not that much different, and all we need to do down here is say git or create tag builder item tags dot, and this is just a normal flower, so we just use small flowers, and then we add block init dot example flower, and that will go ahead and add that like that. However, this actually needs an item, so we just need to use dot as item on that, and that will get us the item and put that in the small flowers tag. Obviously, if you had a tall flower, then you would just use tall flowers, or if you just wanted to add it to the flowers tag generally, then you would just add it to flowers like that, and that should work perfectly fine. So obviously then you need to make sure you run your data gen. Obviously make sure you have your item tag provider added to your data generator as well, since otherwise it's not going to work. And once you've run data gen and go into the game, we should be able to craft our suspicious stew. So if we put a bowl in here and we put the brown mushroom, the red mushroom and our flour, we can see that it makes a suspicious stew, which when we eat it, it should give the effects that we told it to give us. So if we go ahead and eat this, we can see that it gave us speed and jump boost, which is very nice. So that is our suspicious stew done, and obviously that will be found in the creative menu as well. If you search for it in here, you'll see that there is the suspicious stew there that we created. And if we just grab a flower pot, let's go over here and see if we can place it down. So yep, those place fine, and you see they do have that little offset I was talking about as well, and we can place them in the pot as well. And if we broke the pot, it would actually break it correctly. I guess we can just test that real quick. So we can go game mode survival, and you see that drops both of them, which is what it should do. Now let's see if we can go ahead and find some of these in the world. So I have gone ahead and created a new world here so that we can hopefully find them nice and actually there they are. That was actually nice and quick there. So mine are specifically going to be a little harder to find just because of the colors. You'll see they're blue, so kind of hard to find, and obviously the red just makes them look like maybe like poppies, for example. But hopefully we should be able to find some others as well, just to check that wasn't a one-off. Ah, there we go. That actually took a little bit of time there. So there they are. So they are around in the world, and you should be able to find them. There's some more there as well. And yeah, so that is it for this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please do be sure to give it a like, subscribe as well. The next tutorial, we will start with some tree generation, I think, as I have seen a lot of people requesting that, and trees are quite complicated, so we will do those next, I believe. And yeah, obviously, if you have any issues, you can join my Discord server, which is linked in the description below. And if you'd like to help support me to continue making these tutorials, then you can join my Patreon as well. And yeah, I will see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.